Pleased to be joined today by the great Kat Rosenfield. Kat is a novelist. She has written literary novels, YA novels. She's published a comic book with Stan Lee as the co-author. She's a remarkable Twitter follow and a podcaster, and also does cultural commentary for different magazines. Kat, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, my first question to you, I first thought about you in terms of Blood Meridian. I think you posted a few months ago something to the effect of, I decided to finally give this a go. Do I have that right?
Yeah, so I asked my Twitter followers who skew male, this might be important, important context,
Yeah.
if I was going to read any Cormac McCarthy novel, which one should I pick? And Blood Meridian was the first suggestion by an overwhelming margin. Everyone said that this was the best one. This is the must read Cormac McCarthy novel. And so I decided that I would embark on reading Blood Meridian, which I did not know anything about, except that a lot of dudes on Twitter thought it was really good.
Yeah, I think the dudes on Twitter like the book quite a bit. Was it your first format?
No, I read The Road many years back when I was on a sort of an apocalypse fiction kick.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
I think it's probably important to note that my taste is basically as lowbrow as possible. I am the most basic bitch when it comes to my literary preferences. So
Mhm.
I was reading The Road as part of like an exercise in also reading Stephen King's The Stand and Where
Mhm.
Angels Fear to Tread and Zone One by Colson Whitehead. I was like, does it have zombies in it?
Mhm.
Yes, I'm here for it.
Right, right. Did you read The Dog Stars by Peter Heller by any chance?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, I like that book quite a bit. So, do you've read The Road? Do you remember how you first heard of Blood Meridian, or you've probably been hearing about it for a while, I would imagine.
I'm trying to think who I first heard about it from. It might have been Camille Foster, who is a host on the Fifth Column podcast and a
Hmm.
friend, and he's big into Cormac, and he talks about Blood Meridian a lot online and about how much he likes it. But then I also, at some point, started following you on Twitter, and you talk about Blood Meridian a lot. So I would say that like my second exposure to the Blood Meridian discourse as such probably was courtesy of your Twitter feed.
Interesting. Interesting. Well, so let me start off. When you read the book, when you finished the book, what did you love about it? I know there are things you have issue with and some you have some very complicated feelings about it, I think you had told me. Is there something
Yeah.
that you really loved about it?
I mean, the language is beautiful. The way it's written is
Hmm.
beautiful. The descriptions of landscapes are, I mean, as a novelist myself, like
Hmm.
beautiful and also makes me feel like I'm wasting my life trying to write because I'll never get
Gosh.
anywhere close to what he's achieved there. But it's interesting, when I was in the midst of reading Blood Meridian, I think Camille texted me and said, "How much do you love it?" And I wrote back, "Love is not the word that I'm going to describe my feelings about this book."
Right.
I am glad I read it. I also, there's a part of me also that wishes I hadn't,
Mm.
because I found it absolutely brutal and bleak. And I'm not a squeamish person, but
Hmm.
it was it was hard to read, and it also was a book. It's not possible to kind of like blast your way through. Typically, I
Hmm.
read very fast. I'll read an entire book in a day, but this, because it's so dense, I really had to take my time with it, which meant that I spent spent weeks marinating in this just unbelievably violent,
Hmm.
upsetting world, where, among other things, bad things are constantly happening to dogs, which I found very upsetting.
Yeah, that's a thing, right? That's definitely a thing. I want to dive into the whole violence thing and the upsetting world and what you found most upsetting. Have you found, because I know you said you love the prose, have you found that the prose, Cormac's prose, is bled into your own writing in any way?
No, not at this point. And I try to be careful about what I'm reading when I'm also working on a novel. I'm on submission
Right.
right now for my next book, so think good thoughts for me. But I'm
Absolutely.
between I'm between projects, and I but I think that, and we can get into this, more as you see fit. But although I think the prose styling is beautiful, he just writes so differently from the way that I write.
Hmm.
I mean, better obviously than the way that I write, but also there's no interiority to his characters,
Hmm.
which is one of the things about the book that I found intriguing but also irritating. And
Hmm.
so I write domestic suspense, so
Hmm.
it's all about feelings and what the
Hmm.
characters are up to and what they're thinking and such.
That's a very interesting facet. I found over the years teaching it, I started teaching it in grad school in like 2001 and have taught it, I don't know, past 23 years, I guess. And when I was teaching it in the early aughts, my students were so, many of them were so put off by it that they really had trouble with it. And
Mhm.
then as the years have passed, they have less and less and less trouble. And my theory about this is that the book has influenced so much of the media they consume, the video games, the films, the television series, other novels, that they're kind of a swarm in the world of Blood Meridian before they even encounter the book.
That's an interesting theory. I would have maybe taken a more cynical view, although I don't have anywhere near as much contact with young people or with students as you do. So I'm probably just talking out of my ass right now. But I would have wondered if maybe because the prose is so dense and because people don't read as
Mm,
deeply as they once did, whether they're sort of skating over the surface of what's happening and not actually fully kind of internalizing the the extent of the book.
I think there's some of that as well. I think maybe both of those things are in operation in different ways. But I feel like the video, I mean, I was born in 72. Um, so the video games that I had when I was a kid were very rudimentary compared to these immersive worlds. But I feel like the more video game driven students have become, the more they they glom onto this book in a different kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
It seems, and this is, I'm theorizing. I don't actually know this. Just I've watched students' reaction to the book completely change.
That's fascinating. This is reminding me of a conversation I had for a piece that I was reporting last year with the novelist Susan Cheever.
Hmm.
And she mentioned to me, she teaches writing at the Bennington MFA program, or she did. And she was telling me that her students now, it seems that a lot of them are learning to write from watching television, and that this
Hmm.
is impacting the quality of their prose in interesting ways, some positive, some negative. So on the one hand, they're quite good at dialogue, but
Hmm.
they're sort of losing the ability to do anything else. And
Interesting.
one of those things was to kind of capture the interior landscapes of a character, what's happening in their head, what's happening in their heart.
Hmm.
And I just wonder if I mean, in that way, Cormac McCarthy's work, not just Blood Meridian, but I think in general, has that in common, but it's from a completely different angle.
Hmm. Hmm. Let's dive into the violence and the brutality that you were referencing. My first time reading the book was 99, and I had a creative writing professor who was all about it, Brian Evanson, and he loved the book. He loved everything about the book. And when I first tried to read it, um, I don't know that I was put off by the violence in the same way some people are, but I found the book kind of punishing. I felt
Mhm.
I felt kind of ground down by the book. And so I thought the prose was beautiful. I wasn't in love with the book at first and pieced away at it. And then I hit that last 70-page section where the gang disintegrates and they're all out for themselves. And the kid takes on this other trajectory. And then I just feverishly read it. And when I finished the book, I immediately started it again. And the stuff that I found um, like an affliction didn't hit me that way. And the book had begun to work on me. And so I mean, I think my own experience mirrors my first experience, mirrors yours to some degree. But what is it? I mean, the novel is saturated with violence and of a of the highest brutality I can imagine. Can you talk about like what about the violence and the brutality worked on you and maybe you found off-putting and nightmarish?
I'll have to think about this for a second. I'm admittedly a little bit hung up on the idea of somebody finishing this book and immediately going back and wanting to read it again. For me, this book was like the movie The Imitation Game, where I finished it and I was like, I am never ever reading this again.
It's
Like I don't
interesting.
I couldn't fathom. But now this is making me think that maybe I'm being a wimp and I should
No.
actually go back in and give it another try. That maybe it'll be less terrible on a second outing. But the violence and the brutality, I mean, it's it's interesting because it's so, in some ways, it's senseless. You don't have
Hmm.
really any idea why any of these
Hmm.
terrible things are happening. You only know that they do. And I think in that way, actually, the violence in Blood Meridian is very much like real life violence, which
Hmm.
is senseless and it is often offensive in its senselessness. We try to
Hmm.
tell stories about it to try to make more sense of it, but the actual, the nature of the violence itself, and then also the motivations for it tend to be inherently unsatisfying, where it's like, well, I didn't like my wife anymore, but divorce is expensive, so I decided to kill her. Or like a guy cut
Right,
me off in
right,
traffic and I just got really mad, and
right.
and one thing led to another. um and so I do sort of wonder if, although I was frustrated during the read by the lack of sort of internal conveyance of, or rather the lack of any kind of interiority to the characters. You don't know what's happening in their heads. You don't know why they're doing what they're doing.
Right.
But I think also I'd probably find it very unsatisfying to know why they were doing what they were doing. Like
Hmm.
probably it's just, you know, this guy bashed a baby against the wall because, he wanted to see what would happen, or he knew what would happen and he thought that it would be fun to see. And
Right.
that's bleak in its own way.
Yeah,
So maybe preserving a little
absolutely.
bit of mystery is the way to go there. So I did find that I was fascinated by the violence. I wasn't necessarily turned off by it,
Hmm.
except in a couple of moments where something bad was happening to a dog. And I know that this makes me like the ultimate cliche of of a
No.
woman reader, basically.
No, I'm the same way, actually. The violence against animals bothers me in this book way more than the violence against other people.
Yeah. So yeah, there's this scene towards the end when they're at the river and
Yep.
the riverman has a mastiff, and what happened to the mastiff I couldn't bear to, like, I
Right.
saw what was coming on the page and I just kind of flipped it. I was like, I don't think I
Right.
need to read that in great detail.
Right.
Unfortunately, I still kind of caught a glimpse of it, and it's haunted me for months. So
Hmm.
thanks, Cormac, for that. But it's interesting that the violence is rendered as though it is part of the landscape, and the
Hmm.
landscape is rendered very beautifully. So
Hmm.
it there is this kind of terrible mix of brutality with poetry that makes it, I don't know, like, harder to look away from, but also it makes it, I think, that much more vivid, um,
Hmm.
how terrible it is what is happening on the page.
Yeah. Something that I always think about when I'm rereading Blood Meridian is that the violence that I have witnessed in my life, real violence, I've always had the same thought, which is like, one, this is stupid. Like the waste of what is about to happen is just ridiculous that this is happening. And the other thought is, I want this to be over. Like I want this to stop. So that's been my reaction to real world violence. Representations of violence on the page or the screen, um, I feel like I'm very critical of, because I think it can be done in such a way that it can be artistically interesting, and narratively interesting, serve a plot, um, or a character function. I love what you say that in Blood Meridian, the violence is rendered as though it's part of the landscape. I think that is exactly right. I think that's exactly right.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the difference between violence in books and violence on screen. I actually, this is probably paradoxical or hypocritical of me, but I'm a huge fan of exceptionally stylized violence.
Hmm.
I love Quentin Tarantino
I was
movies.
just thinking
I love,
Tarantino. Yeah.
yeah, I love the series The Boys.
Mhm.
Um, if you can find a way to make the violence kind of spectacular, and I mean, not just like artisanal, but so over the top to the point where it becomes funny, because
Hmm.
it's sort of transcended any sense of an actual real life thing happening.
Right.
I'm actually a huge fan of that. It's one of my favorite genres of thing, that's not obviously reproducible in
Hmm.
literature,
Hmm.
where you have to rely on your mind's eye to supply any images that you're getting. And um, yeah, I and maybe that has a lot to do with why the violence in Blood Meridian particularly I found more upsetting, because it is basically based entirely on what you as a reader are capable of imagining. He paints a picture, and then you can make that picture as vivid in your mind as you want to. And if you have a vivid imagination, which I do,
Hmm.
it can get pretty intense pretty fast.
Yes, I think that's correct. I mean, I resonate with that. The violence in this book seems so, hits me as so excessive, absolutely senseless. We're told by the narrator that the kid has a taste for mindless violence on the first page, that people in Texas never behaved like the people in Blood Meridian. Texas has a blood-soaked history. There were atrocities, there was a lot of violence, but Cormac focuses on only that to the exclusion of, the people who settled Texas were very into community. They were very into having visitors. They were very into dancing. And you don't see the love of community or the love of anything in this book. You're focusing purely on the horror. My own belief about this book is that it's a horror novel masquerading as a Western.
Oh, that, yes, that is interesting. What I immediately thought of when you said that was the this movie Bone Tomahawk,
Hmm.
which is actually kind of like a Western epic masquerading as a horror movie. So they're
Right.
an interesting inverse there. So I'm curious how many times you have read this book.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe
Have you lost count?
I've
Is
lost
it
count.
less than
I've
20? More than 20?
more than 20, easily more than 20. Easily more than
Okay.
20.
But the violence in it still shocks you.
It doesn't shock me. It actually, to be perfectly honest, the violence, because I'm so familiar with the book, the violence strikes me as a kind of energy. And whereas generally the depictions of violence in literature summon a sense of sadness or some emotion that feels like I'm slowing down emotionally, or I feel like things are getting slower and sadder. In this novel, and pretty much only this novel, there is this weird, um, like infusing of energy that the violence creates this momentum in the book. Well, the violence creates this weird momentum in me where I feel like I'm being propelled through something, exhilarated, right? Um, and the violence in any other book, even Cormac's other books, doesn't hit me that way.
Interesting. I think that my impression of it was somewhat different. I would say that if in my read, the violence kind of sets the pace
Hmm.
for the novel, which means that when you reach these scenes of, they're battling, there's gunfire, there's scalping, arrows flying
Hmm.
around that seem to go on forever. Um,
Hmm.
and you have to kind of, I mean this also speaks again to the density of the prose. You can't hurry through them, you can't become exhilarated by them, really, or I couldn't,
Hmm.
in the way that I might if I were reading a more kind of explicitly horror or action kind of a novel, or a fantasy where there's like some kind of sword fight happening. um
Hmm.
I think, yeah, this is like the violence, or these scenes when violence is occurring are sort of the moment at which you can most clearly hear the heartbeat of the story,
Hmm.
and that's and it's coming through clear, and that's because it's like it's sort of the rhythm, it's the rhythm of the entire story, and then it's, so okay,
I
I'm just
think
trying
that's
to think.
right. I think that's right. Like the
Okay,
violence creates this heartbeat, pulse,
and it's always in the background, it's not,
always.
yeah. um yeah, I'm thinking about like I mean, there is that first scene where they are out on the plane, and the um oh, I've forgotten the name of the Indian tribe. Is it
Oh, the Comanches,
the Comanches? Yeah, I was about to say Apaches. Like that's not right. Are bearing down on them,
right?
and um, the it's so suffused with dread, and you can't hurry through it. It's like you are just standing there, and you have to let it come at its pace, which is one of the truly horrifying things about that scene and about many moments in the book.
It's interesting. I've recommended it to so many people over the years, and my first year in my PhD program, I had this like really great Shakespeare scholar. Um, her name's Diana de Armas Wilson, and I was always talking about Blood Meridian, and she's like, I want to read this book that you're talking about. I was like, okay. So she came into class right after reading the Comanche attack. And she's
Mhm.
like, I just read the Comanche attack. It's the best thing I've ever read. And I was like, and we just started like, I mean, we're supposed to be starting class and we just start jamming on Blood Meridian and everyone else is just looking at us like, what's going on? But I think that kind of energy that I saw infectious in her, like her face lit up the way you wouldn't expect this very uh, urbane, um, middle-aged woman who studies Shakespeare. Like she was just, there was this light in her face. And I've seen that. And I've also seen what you're describing on the faces of my students. Like, why would you have us read something like this? What are you thinking? And now the split is about, it used to be about like 30% of the students ended up loving it and 70% were shaking their heads. And now it's about 70% who love it.
Interesting. That's ironically, that makes me feel kind of optimistic about the youth. So that's a good thing.
When I'm teaching McCarthy, I often get optimistic about the youth. They, I mean, they connect with him in a way they don't connect with other people. I taught two other Cormac novels in my class in the spring. I taught Suttree and Outer Dark, and most students didn't like it at all, like either of them. But this woman after class, she was kind of talking to other students. She goes, "Yeah, I didn't like these books." And she was talking to another young woman. She didn't like them. She goes, "You ought to read Blood Meridian, though. It's actually good." I was like, "Wow!" Like not anywhere near like these Suttree is like this um very psychologically dense novel. It's all about interiority. There's very little violence, certainly nothing of the order of Blood Meridian. And she wasn't having it, but she would like recommend Blood Meridian as, oh, give this a go. I thought this is interesting.
Yeah. Well, I'm also curious. You're talking about the response of a Shakespeare scholar to this work, which, I
Hmm.
mean, Shakespeare, obviously, he wrote for the stage. And I think
Hmm.
I, I've never appreciated his stuff as much as I do when I've seen it
Hmm.
staged, or
Hmm.
seen it in a film. And I understand that there has been a sort of a long-standing desire to adapt Blood Meridian into a
Hmm.
movie, which strikes me as something that could go really well or really wrong.
No
What are
kidding.
your thoughts about it?
So I talked to the director last year, and different people have had the rights over the years, and Ridley Scott had it for a while, and he just said this novel can't be adapted. And
Ugh, Ridley, come on. I'm sorry,
yeah,
but
it's interesting, interesting. And then James Franco had the rights for a while, and thankfully that fell through. He would have ruined it like he's ruined everything. Faulkner and McCarthy both. He directed Child of God, the McCarthy novel. And it's terrible. I think it's terrible at least. Um, but then John Hillcoat got it, and he was Cormac's pick, and Hillcoat made a great film that came out in 2005 called The Proposition, which is a Western set in like 19th century Australia. And it is deeply informed by Blood Meridian. It's written by Nick Cave, of all people. It's a fantastic film. And when I saw that in 2005, I was like, Hillcoat should direct. He should do Blood Meridian. So
Mhm.
Cormac thought so too, and he began writing an adaptation of his own book for Hillcoat. And then he died last year while he was doing it.
Mhm.
And so Hillcoat's moving on with the project. My own feeling is that this should either be an animated film with really great voice actors, or it should be an 8-part HBO series. But uh, I hope that the movie turns out to be great. I think the odds are very much against it turning out to be great.
That is true, but I'm intrigued by the idea of this as an animated
Hmm.
film. I feel like there is the risk of it becoming cartoonish.
Hmm.
You know, if it is literally a cartoon,
Hmm.
it would be a real challenge to prevent it from tipping over into that.
For
Uh,
sure.
the the eight-part limited series that seems very in keeping with the pace of the book.
Right.
And I'm just thinking about how interesting it is that Cormac starts off each chapter by sort of letting you know what's coming,
Hmm.
um, with these little subheadings, so you understand like the landscapes that you're going to be kind of passing through, and you can kind of mark time. There were definitely points at which I read those little subheadings and then I went back to them because I was like, please tell me I'm nearly done with this. Like
Right. Right.
this is this is a lot.
It is a lot. I mean, it's old. My teacher, Brian Evanson, used to say, he said it was a Bible of violence. That's what his
Mhm.
argument is. Like, this is like a Bible. This is a Bible of violence. And it it certainly is that in addition to other things. Speaking of the Bible, my one of the things I always ask people once they've read the book, what did you make of the vast abhorrence of the judge?
Um, I was so preoccupied with everything else going on in the book
Mm,
that I realized after I'd finished it that I had failed to like fully comprehend who or what the judge
hmm.
was. And I ended up listening to one of your lectures, I think your first lecture on it, because you'd put it on YouTube, which I
Hmm.
think it sounded like maybe you were talking to an undergrad
Hmm.
class.
That's right.
Um, yeah, I was on a long drive and I listened to that while I was driving. And that actually was very helpful. It illuminated
Mm,
some things for me about the book that I had not picked up on or like hadn't really fully understood. Um, but the judge, I mean, I was so intrigued by the moments in which he is like drawing pictures of the landscape by
right.
way of kind of taking ownership of it.
Hmm.
And it's like, like he was capturing it for himself.
Precisely so. Precisely so.
And that in turn made me think about the kind of old myth that like if somebody manages to take your picture, take your photograph, they'll steal your soul.
Yeah.
It was sort of like that same idea, but manifesting in a different and I think much more sinister way. And then the fact that he appears to be like not aged at the end of the
Hmm.
book,
Hmm.
and I would be very interested to hear your theories about what was in that outhouse at the end.
Mm.
I've not thought too hard about it because I feel like there's all manner of horrible things it could be. But yeah, I mean, I think to say that he is the devil would be too banal. I don't think it's quite that, but he's
That's
clearly
right.
the embodiment of horror,
Hmm.
and of
Hmm.
kind of like senseless evil.
Hmm. I this thing you just said about you're coming up on the judge and the outhouse. Oh, the judge's sketches. There's that scene where he's telling a story and he wants to draw Webster's picture, sketch Webster's portrait in his book, in his ledger. And Webster says, don't do that. I don't want it shown around to other people. And the gang begins to make fun of Webster, and Judge Holden like stops them. He's like, no, 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 no. Like he has a real concern. Like I painted this portrait of an old Waco man, and after I left, he became concerned that something could happen to it and that he would be affected. So he came and found me, and we took it into a cave and buried it. Um, so, I mean, that's very much the whole capturing a representation of something will capture that person's soul. The interesting thing about the judge's sketches is that he'll sketch a piece of Spanish armor, or
Hmm.
he'll ride by a cliff face and there'll be like this intricate writing and like a lost, tongue, symbols. He'll copy these things down and then he'll destroy the original so that all his left is his representation.
Hmm.
Think that's key to what the judge is and what he's a judge of. He gets the copy, he makes the copy of the original, and then he destroys the original. So all that is left is his representation. Just like most of us, or many people, won't read a history of the American Southwest, but they've read Blood Meridian.
Hmm.
They've read Cormac's copy.
Right, right, which is representative of something, but not necessarily. Um, ugh, I'm sorry that my dog just came and puked all over the floor right
Oh
next to
no!
me.
Oh no!
Which is fine. You know, he does that sometimes. But I please excuse the interruption.
No.
What I was about to say is that the judge's sketching is interesting. Like at the cycle of sketching followed by destruction, it's like the inverse of what happens when somebody is like a fabricator or a sculptor, and they sketch their idea before they make it reality. He sketches the reality and then makes it into nothing.
Yeah, and gets rid of the original. The kid has a
Yeah.
dream when he's under the influence of ether, when he's having surgery in San Diego, and he dreams that the judge comes and visits him. And in this dream, the judge is enshadowing a counterfeiter. This man is making coins. And Cormac says that the counterfeiter is at contriving from cold slag, brute in the crucible, a face that will pass, an image that will render this residual species current in the markets where men barter. Of this is the judge, and the night does not end. And so the judge in the kid's dream is overseeing, judging this counterfeiter trying to create a copy that can pass as the real thing. And I think that's very much what Cormac is up to in this book and what the judge is up to as a character, that he's the
Hmm.
judge of counterfeits and representations that become true.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, he's a terrifying figure. I was probably the most struck, even though it's like one of the least horrible things he does. But when he first comes on the scene and he gets up at this tent revival and he says that the preacher was run out of,
Hmm.
previous towns for, I can't remember if it was that he'd like had sex with animals or children or
Hmm.
both.
That's right.
Um, and then and everybody like runs him out of town on a rail. I've wondered periodically what actually happened to that man. Did he make it? Probably not.
Hmm. Probably not.
um and and then the judge is in the bar and someone says, how did you know all that about that guy? And he's like, oh, I didn't, I just made it up.
Right.
And I mean, I was like, that is astronomically evil. That is like
Hmm.
it made it so that like nothing that came after that obviously could come as a surprise. And yeah, it just, I don't know, it was so unbelievably amoral and calculated to cause chaos that I was sort of fascinated by that.
Yeah, Coleridge wrote this famous essay about Othello, and he talks about Iago, and he says that Iago is possessed of a motiveless malignancy. And I think the judge is possessed of the same thing, a motiveless malignancy.
Mm.
which
Yeah.
makes the, like you talk about the violence, the brutality, one of the most brutal things that happens, we are not shown. What happens to the kid in the outhouse when he's the man in Fort Griffin? And after page of the most horrific violence that's ever been captured in American literature, um, Cormac obscures that.
Yes. He preserves the mystery. Um, which is almost brutal in a different way. This may be very naive of me, but there was a point where, after the kid had grown up and
Hmm.
you see him as a man, you see him, he's still not a great person, but
Right.
the years have somewhat tempered his tendencies. And
Hmm.
there is a sense of like, I don't know if it's quite as far as like regret, but there's a when he kills this kid who I'm sure
Hmm.
reminds him of himself in certain ways. There's a sense that
100%.
he's sort of sorry to
Hmm.
have done it or to have had to do it, but there sort of was no other option. And I think that is not something he would have felt as a younger man. And so there was a point at which, like an idiot, I was like, maybe this kid's gonna make it. Maybe he's gonna be all right. Maybe we're gonna get not a happy ending, but like
Yeah.
something approaching that. And then there's the scene in the bar, and then the bear, which was
Oh,
also
destroys me every time, Cat.
I yeah that's another one that I read and then wished I hadn't. Still think about that and get really
It's
upset.
so sad. It's so sad.
It is, and that I think was sort of the hint, even before the judge and the outhouse and so on, that the cycle does not end. Things do not get better. No, it never becomes less senseless or less offensive. It's just this is just how it is.
An interesting thing, I agree with everything you said. Interesting thing about that, the novel proper ends with the judge dancing and saying he'll never die. And then you flip the page and you have this epilogue where a man is building a fence. He's using a post hole digger to make holes for the fence posts. And I think the significance of that is when barbed wire was created in the 1870s, the West was fenced off overnight, pretty much. And
Mm-hmm.
this way of inexpensively fencing, you know, miles and miles, thousands of miles of prairie ended the Wild West. The cattle drives were over, the cattle towns were over. It all ended. It was just over. And so I think there's an interesting irony in the judge saying, he'll never die. And then you flip the page and the whole West has ended with this little invention. So I think
Mm-hmm.
there's a tension. Of course, we've seen that the judge is pretty capable in San Diego, so he might do very well in city life. But this way of life, this freedom of movement that we've seen in the rest of the novel is gone.
Yeah, I didn't know the historical context for that. So I found the little epilogue, a little bit perplexing. I'm glad
Hmm.
to know what that meant.
Yeah. So having read the book and thought about the book, do you have any ideas about why like this novel has seized such an exalted place in the culture and was spoken about with such reverence? And like you said, who's I know him on Twitter and we and back and forth. He's a big academic. I mean, all
Sorry,
these.
Aaron, you're becoming very garbled, so I can't
Oh
understand what
no.
you're saying.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Sort of. You still sound like you're underwater.
Oh no.
Wait, now you're good. You're good.
Okay. Who knows? Oh, I was just saying that this novel has seized such a massive an exalted place, not massive, but an exalted place in American letters and culture. Camille, who we both know, is a fan, like all these different people. Mindy Kaling about 5 years ago gave an interview to the New York Times, and they asked her what her favorite book was, and she said Blood Meridian. I mean, it's everywhere. People you don't necessarily think would be enormous fans are. Do you have a sense of why that's the case? Why this book is for so many people the book?
God, that's a really interesting question. Um, I mean, so the one thing that strikes me is that it's a very almost gender neutral
Mm,
kind of a story.
hmm
I think, a lot of novels, especially contemporary novels, like the readership skews female. The subject matter often also skews kind of more towards stuff that women are interested in,
hmm
and the way that it's written also. But this is, I mean, obviously the content itself is like, manly men doing
hmm
toxically masculine things,
Right, right.
but yeah, I think it's, there's something about that that makes it accessible. It's not, you're not going to be turned off by
hmm
it on that account. Really, the only way that you could be turned off by this book is if either you're not captivated by the prose, which, like, what kind of
hmm
troglodyte,
hmm
and then if you are put off by the violence.
hmm
But I don't think, if you're captivated by the prose, then you're not going to be put off by the violence. You'd be fascinated by it, but you're not going to put the book down because of
Right.
it. So yeah, it's actually, it's stunning when you think about what a balancing act this is between beauty and brutality, and history. I think the other thing is, like, when you read this, you get a sense of that you're not just reading some story some guy made up, that you are
hmm
investing in some way in understanding the origins of the American project.
That's it.
Um, yeah. Okay.
That's it. I know that's it. I mean, that you feel like this is going to give me the truth about where we came from, where all this came from.
Yeah. And I mean, there's also just kind of like at this point, I think, because the book has such a cult following and is so synonymous with being like the best and the most serious and the most vivid work of its type. I certainly was happy to advertise publicly that I was reading it. I was, look how cool I am. Right.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, there's cachet. There's a cachet to reading it, more so, I think, than many other novels. And what's interesting is that that will be kind of self-perpetuating the more people that read it. I don't think you're ever going to get somebody being like, "Oh, Blood Meridian, that's like so 2015 or whatever." Like, it's
That's
classic.
great. Yeah, it definitely does come at you with this sense that this is in the lineage of Moby Dick and Absalom and Beloved. That this is great American literature. This is a book as the world. Something about the book that teaching the book, I've been surprised by. I suppose this is kind of messed up, but I think it's pretty interesting. After the point in the book where the ex-priest tells the kid the story of the judge's gunpowder and how the judge, saved their necks by creating this gunpowder out of guano and saltpeter and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Mm.
Some of the young women in my classes over the years have said they thought the judge was hot. And I thought that was I certainly didn't expect that reaction, but it's happened a number of times. And some women will be like, hot? He's not hot, but he's very interesting. And so I think the mystery of him and the power of him certainly leads to the mm, fascination with him. I I I guess I'm guessing that you didn't think the judge was hot, but I've been wrong before.
It didn't occur to me, honestly, to read the book
Right.
through that lens, which
Yeah.
I will admit is unusual for me. I'm always looking for who's hot. But yeah,
Interesting.
that part of my brain was not active in the reading of Blood Meridian.
Right.
But I'm just thinking about like the judge is hot. Yeah, I mean, I can see the argument for that in the same way I can see the argument that Hannibal Lecter is hot.
Oh, yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah. Right, right.
yeah, there's something about the. I mean, maybe the thing is like I can fix him, you
Ah!
know.
The judge is the ultimate fixer-upper. I love it. I can change him. I can change him. He's a mass murdering, Latin speaking psychopath, but he's got a good heart.
Yeah. And he's very tall and has large hands and feet for, whatever that implies. So,
Yeah, it's interesting. Last question. Cormac's been accused, you kind of talked about this a little bit, but Cormac has been accused of being a guy's writer. Um, do you find that to be true? Do you think that that's a fair assessment?
um, well, I mean, he's not interested in feelings, clearly. Uh,
Hmm.
and so I understand why people would say so. And there is something, yeah, testosterone heavy in
Hmm.
his work, which I don't consider to be a bad thing.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I mean, I get the sense that like people some people say that and they mean it in a pejorative way.
Hmm.
But I would say it's true and it's not a bad thing. And it
Hmm.
doesn't mean that the book is not accessible to women,
Hmm.
but just that it speaks to. I mean, there's a reason why the all the characters in it and all of the real life entities who engaged in this type of behavior, who had this type of life story. They're all men, and
Hmm.
there's a reason for that.
Yeah, well, I think that's a perfect conclusion. The book skews male, but the judge is hot.
you you said that, not me.
Ah, Kat, thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. This was fantastic.
Oh, thanks for having me. I was so glad to be able to talk about this book with someone who knows what they're talking about. It helped me make more sense of it.
That's awesome.